Hey, today I want to talk to you about Project Sveltos. You may have heard of it. It's getting a lot of attention on LinkedIn and in the cloud native community. And today, in this video, I'm going to show you why it's so popular, why it's getting so much traction, and what you can do with it. If that sounds cool to you, consider dropping a like. If you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing. And if there's other things that you want to see, especially around Sveltos, add a comment. I am taking suggestions. All that being said, let's dive into it. And just real quick, I want to thank Gianluca Mardente, one of the maintainers of Sveltos, who helped me put this video together. So what is Project Sveltos? Well, it's an add-on controller for Kubernetes clusters, and the real power comes in when you have multiple Kubernetes clusters that you need to manage, and especially when you need to configure multiple Kubernetes clusters to have a lot of the same features. So what does that look like? Well, usually you're going to deploy Sveltos in a management cluster, and that's going to then have access to all these different clusters wherever they may be. They could be in any one of your cloud providers or anywhere that your management cluster has access to. Deploying Sveltos in your management cluster is really straightforward. It's just like any other third-party software that you're going to install in your Kubernetes cluster. You can either deploy with the raw YAMLs that are accessible in GitHub, or you can deploy with a Helm chart, which is what I did. Once you have it installed, it's beneficial to also have the CLI tool that's going to work with Sveltos and configure all of your clusters that you want to manage. You can install it from the Releases tab in the Sveltos Cuddle repo, right? All the different binaries are listed here, or you could just pull this down. It is a Golang project, build it locally and run go install, which is what I did. So how do I get started with managing my clusters? Well, the first thing I need to do is register my clusters with Sveltos. And right now I'm pointing at my management environment, right? That's where my kubectl context is pointing to. And I'm going to see how many Sveltos clusters do I have registered in this environment. And when I hit enter, the answer is only one. It's the management cluster itself. So when you install Sveltos, it's aware of its own running context. So you can manage the management cluster with Sveltos. That's pretty cool. Well, I want to add more clusters. So I've got some commands copied over here, and then I'm just going to copy and paste. Right. The first one I'm going to register is my dev cluster. So if we look at this command, I've got Sveltos Cuddle register cluster. I'm going to put it in the default namespace. You may or may not want to do that. You may want to have a namespace specifically for each cluster, or a namespace just for Sveltos to manage its different resources and different clusters. I'm just, hey, for the sake of ease right now, putting it in default. I'm calling this cluster development. I'm pointing to a kube config. This is important because when you're registering a cluster, you have to ensure that Sveltos can access all of this stuff. It has to access the API, meaning it needs to know where the API endpoint lives. It has to have some sort of credential to be able to update resources in that API. So you need to provision a kube config that Sveltos can access, and then reference that when you're registering the cluster. And then finally, equally important are the labels. So the way that Sveltos works is it looks for labels that you've applied to clusters, and it matches those with the resources that you're going to add. And we'll see what that looks like in a second. Just remember, I've got 3 labels here that I'm applying to this cluster. First, colon equals Lacy. That's just for vanity purposes and for just fun. Then we have purpose, API. So I'm saying that this cluster's purpose is for managing APIs, and then the environment is dev. So I'm going to hit enter, and things are going to happen. Cluster development successfully registered. All right. So if I run this command again, get Sveltos cluster, I should see 2. And I do. I see 2 clusters. That's fantastic. So let me go ahead, clear this out. I'm also going to register my staging cluster, and it's going to have similar labels. I'm going to point to the staging kube config. Great. That's registered as well. So now I have 3 clusters. How about that? All right. Now that I've gotten them registered, let's pop into Lens real quick. So here I am in Lens, and I'm looking at my management cluster. So you can see I've got all the Sveltos pods deployed. That's great. Well, if I come into my development environment, right? I've filtered out my namespaces to see, do I have a namespace called API? And it turns out I don't. That's interesting. And in my staging environment, do I have a namespace called API? I don't. So I want to create that namespace in these environments. So let me pop back into VS Code real quick. All right. In VS Code, I've got a config map that I've created, and it's called create namespace. And unlike most config maps, this has one data entry, and that data entry is a long string, right? A long YAML string. And this represents this string, the contents of this string is what would be in a YAML file if we were creating a namespace. So what I'm doing is I'm specifying under this key the contents of what would otherwise be its own YAML file. So why would I do that? Well, if I applied this as a YAML file to a Kubernetes cluster, it would create that namespace in that target Kubernetes cluster, right? I want to use this. I want my management cluster to have this resource reference to be able to apply it to the clusters that it's managing. And so next step is to apply this and then also create a cluster profile. This cluster profile is going to reference this config map, create namespace that's going to live in the default namespace of my management cluster, and it's going to apply that namespace resource to any cluster that has purpose API as its labels. So let's see how that works. First, I'm going to come into, I'm going to kubectl, apply f, what is it? CM something something. Yep, create NS. And that's going to apply, and it's going to do its thing. Cool. Let me get back up to the top. Then I'm going to kubectl apply f cp for cluster profile. Deploy ns.yaml. All right. So now it's applied that cluster profile, right? And any cluster that has the labels purpose API is going to get that namespace. So let's see if that worked. Do you think it worked? I think it worked. So here we are. We're in stage, and the API namespace has already been created 16 seconds ago. If I go to dev, the API namespace has been created. Look at that. So Sveltos, just with that one cluster profile, was able to create the API namespace in both of my clusters. Now, that's cool and all. It's created those after I've already registered the clusters. Wouldn't it be cool if Sveltos was smart enough and declarative enough to apply that to a third cluster? Right? I've already created the cluster profile. I've already created the config map, and I've created my dev and my stage, or I've registered my dev and stage environments with Sveltos. Well, what about my prod environment? Now, in prod, I've got my filter applied, API, and I'm in namespaces. There is no API namespace. So back to VS Code. I've got my register command copied here for registering my prod cluster. And I've got purpose, there it is, equals API. So I've got the label applied. Let's see what happens if I register this cluster. It's registered. And I come into Lens. There it is. 4 seconds ago it was created. How did that happen so fast? I don't know, but it did. So that was pretty cool. With one cluster profile, I was able to deploy a namespace to 3 different clusters all at once, just using labels. How awesome is that? It's also boring. Namespaces, that's not exciting. Let's do something really nuts. Let's deploy Envoy Gateway to all 3 clusters all at the same time. So I've got this cluster profile for Envoy Gateway. And yes, I am using a Helm chart to install it. With Sveltos, you can actually install add-ons using their Helm chart. And if I wanted to, I could add additional values in this block of configuration sets right here, right? I could add values and go from here and set up whatever values I wanted to. And apparently Copilot already knows that. All right, moving on. So from here, I'm going to come back into Lens. I want to see something real quick. In Lens, if I look at the labels on each of my clusters, right? Colin Lacey, m equals dev. I've got some additional labels that Sveltos applied, and then purpose equals API. Well, I want to add a label. I want to add a label that says, what is it supposed to say? It's supposed to say API gateway is Envoy. So I'm going to label this the same way that I would any other Kubernetes resource, right? It's a custom resource, but I'm still going to label it the same way I would any other. So I'm going to say my Sveltos cluster development API gateway equals Envoy. And if I come back into Lens and I look at my development cluster again, here it is, right? API gateway equals Envoy. So that label's applied. I'm going to do the same thing with staging. And I'm going to do the same thing with prod. Production. There we go. All right, so those are my 3 clusters. They've all been labeled. And now I want to apply this cluster profile, right? And it's going to say anything that has purpose API and API gateway is Envoy, it's going to apply this Helm chart. Now, if I only did 2 of those clusters with the API gateway is Envoy, then only 2 would have matched the full label selectors that I put in this cluster profile. So only 2 would have gotten this Helm chart. I did all 3 because I'm feeling exciting. So I'm going to kubectl apply f cp deploy eg equal eg day YAML. There we go. Great. So now that's deployed. And what it's going to do is, if I come back into Lens, look in prod, let me see if I have an Envoy gateway namespace that was created 7 seconds ago now. And let's go look. So this is prod, right? Stage. Envoy gateway. That was 18 seconds ago, right? So it's building out the namespace. Does it also build out the resources? Well, let's come into Envoy gateway system. Yes, right? It's got a job. It's got a replica set. All of these resources for Envoy gateway have now been added through the power of the cluster profile and some sweet labels. How cool is that? Now, I only did this with 3 clusters, right? I wanted my 3 environments to match, dev, stage, and prod. What if I did this with a fleet of clusters for different regions in the same environment? What if I did this for dev clusters for all my devs? I want them all to have maybe the same deployment of Coder and the same deployment of Postgres, or maybe some of them are only going to get Redis. The use cases can go pretty far with how you can apply Sveltos to manage the add-ons in your cluster. And that's why it's so exciting. That's why it's getting all this traction. If you like this video, I am going to do more about Sveltos. You can see I'm clearly excited. So please consider liking, consider subscribing if you want to keep up to date with all the different Sveltos use cases I'm going to go crazy on. And if there's other content you want to see, please consider adding a comment. Let me know what it is. I am taking suggestions. Thanks for watching.